The No Child Left Behind Act would be nowhere today without the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This act was passed by President Lyndon Johnson during the War on Poverty, and it was his fight for disadvantaged students. He wanted disadvantaged students and all other students to receive a well-rounded education. As a former teacher in Texas, Johnson knew exactly what it was like to work with students that were at a disadvantage. He worked with many Mexican-American students that only knew how to speak any kind of Mexican or Spanish, and they really didn't understand the English language, but he worked with them and he wanted to make sure that they understood the English language, especially living in Texas. Before Johnson was the president, the civil rights era was in full swing. Many African Americans were denied the right to go to school with white students. They could not do the same things that white students were doing. There were even lynchings of African Americans just because of the color of their skin. But when Johnson became president, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to discriminate against someone because of the color of their skin in the workplace, in the school, in restaurants, and so on, in public places. So in hopes of becoming a less discriminated world, Johnson brought this act in. But in schools, it wasn't until the Elementary and Secondary Act of 1965 came along until schools really pushed for helping African Americans and bringing them into the schools so that they were integrated and whites and blacks could go to school together without a problem. The Digital Educational Company has a video titled "A Struggle for Educational Equality" of 1950 to 1980. And they say that the carrot and stick method was used by Lyndon Johnson. The stick was the Civil Rights Act, and the carrot was a $4 billion investment over 4 years. This investment was to be spread out over the nation to help schools. But the only catch was that schools had to become integrated. They had to bring African Americans and whites into the school before they would receive any kind of funding from the state. This made people a little bit upset because they had to bring African Americans into school, but they were also happy to be receiving the funding that they were getting. So, coming back to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Ohio Education Association quotes that the ESEA provided for the first time a partnership among federal, state, and local governments to address part of a larger national agenda. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act really brought back, or really made states understand that African Americans need to be brought into the system so that there really is a sense of equality between African Americans and white students. So, to today, we have the No Child Left Behind Act, where all students are to receive a well-rounded education. And the Ohio Education Association quotes that the education debate has been dominated by the desire of policymakers to see evidence that federal investments in education programs yield tangible, measurable results in terms of student achievement and success. This kind of ties into the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, because back then schools had to become integrated before they would receive funding. And now, today, teachers have to make sure that all of their students understand what's going on in the classroom before they can give a test. So when students are understanding of all the knowledge and they take tests and they receive good grades on these tests, the states can then receive funding from the government, which is an incentive when teachers make sure that their students understand what's going on in the classroom, and these students can take these tests and pass tests and understand the material, then the states can receive more funding to help students. So that affects me because I'm going to be a teacher in about 2 years, and I need to make sure that all of my students understand what's going on in the classroom. Funding is a very important part of a school system, because school systems need money to buy textbooks and school books and any kind of materials so that any teachers that come into the school are able to use these funds and to help students get better grades and understand the material a little bit better. And so this all would have never been possible if Lyndon Johnson did not enact the Elementary and Secondary Act of 1965. And as a teacher, I feel personally responsible for all of my students, and I would hope that all of my students would be able to understand all of the material and get better grades and do better. And that's something that the No Child Left Behind Act has implemented on teachers. According to the U.S. Department of Education, the graduation rates have increased from 2004 to 2006 from 73% to 83.3% in Kentucky. The No Child Left Behind Act has been very, very helpful to help students go on to have a better life. Even if they don't go to college, they will have a high school education that can help them in the real world. And also, according to the U.S. Department of Education, Kentucky has received close to $3 million in No Child Left Behind funding. And that definitely helps teachers get textbooks that they need and help students understand material, and they're able to do everything that they can so that students can test and go on into the world knowing what they're doing in certain subjects like in math and science and any kind of subject. And I just want to close by by a quote by President Johnson that says, "Poverty must not be a bar to learning, and learning must offer an escape from poverty." So if it wasn't for Lyndon B. Johnson, we wouldn't have any kind of an educational system like we do today.